Hi, I'm Dorian Lamb, and welcome to Start with the Close in Mind. As an owner of a title company and a seasoned real estate professional, I've seen firsthand how focusing on the close is the key to getting the results you want. What I've learned over the years is that this principle doesn't just apply to real estate, it applies to business, strategy, and life. Each episode, I'll share the tools, insights, and real-world experiences, both the wins and the lessons learned, that have helped me and others achieve our goals. I will also bring on some of the most successful business minds across industries to uncover how they approach deals, decisions, and success by starting with the close in mind. Welcome to Start with the Close in Mind. Let's dive in. All right, today, welcome back to the Start with the Close in Mind podcast. Today we have Emily Zhu, Vice President of USIF, which is a regional center, United States Immigration Fund. And today we're going to learn about EB5. We're going to learn what it is. We're going to learn how to use it. And we're going to talk about how to get it. Before we get to that, though, Emily, welcome to the show. Give us some background. How did you end up where you are today?
Yeah, sure. So Dorian, first of all, it's a pleasure of inviting me to your podcast. And my name is Emily, and I am a VP in Business Development for U.S. Immigration Fund. Involved in the EB5 world actually through the help of Dorian. We met at a commercial real estate event and about a decade ago. And back then, EB5 was, in the peak area. So a lot of developers have seeking out for the EB5 capital, and Dorian was nice enough to introduce me to an immigration firm who became my employer. So I learned EB5 through that employment. So long story short, and ever since then, I've been involved in 24 of projects nationwide. And EB5 investors, internationally. Yeah, so it's a very interesting program. And I think through this experience, I met a lot of developers, the regional centers, and help investors, and basically throughout the entire food chain of the EB5 world.
It's great. Who would have known, right? Going back, you reminded me of
Yeah.
that instance and that I'm part of your journey. So
Yeah.
it kind of makes sense that we're here today discussing your journey and
Right.
your journey to EB5. As you know, the name of the show is Start with the Close in Mind. And the main takeaway from the show is always about how our audience can learn from the experiences that the likes of you and I have had with
Mhm.
regards to the things that we can keep in mind at the beginning rather than learning about it later down the line. And, you have mentioned that you've raised EB5 money and through many different investors. What are some of the things that many need to know or, that people should know that are critical about EB5? Explain when and why someone should consider it.
Yeah, sure. Of course. I think, the EB5 is very interesting because it actually runs up two parallel timelines. So on the one hand, you have a project, right? The project from the ideation to until, for instance, if it's a condo project, you initially have an idea and then the developer will go out and, get the land and see how much it can be built and potentially be sold. So they have a timeline in terms of a project. And then on the other hand, you have the investor who is investing or selecting these projects, and they have their timeline in terms of immigration. So from the moment an investor is seeking out a project to the point where the investor was able to invest and subscribe to the project until, the 520 is the conditional green card stage, and also proving the 10 jobs, which is one of the E5 requirements, is completed. So they have their timeline. So in order to these timeline to fit into each other, you can call it a science and an art. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of elements at play. So I think, points that both parties needs to be aware of. For instance, on the developer side, the developer should think, yeah, great, it is maybe an effective and efficient capital, but also is subject to a lot of regulations, right? It's not just the regular capital that, for instance, you go to the bank and borrow a loan. And of course, the bank will do certain, due diligence in terms of, whether your project makes sense. But also for the EB5 capital, there is an extra layer of securities law where, the developer need to be aware of. So these capital are subject to scrutiny. And then, by the same token, the investor is also need to be aware of, the US immigration is different from a lot of countries. It's not based on, for instance, in Australia, where, the program is more oriented towards your personal qualification, for instance, your age, your type of degree, whether it's needed or encouraged by the country. So they have a grading system. But for the EB5, it's really a investment program. So your capital has to be put at risk. So that requires the investor to do a lot of due diligence before he or she makes the decision to invest in a project. So I would say, to piggyback what you said, to start with the close in mind, both party needs to be aware of, this due diligence plays an important role in the EB5 world.
Yeah, it sounds complicated. I won't lie, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned multiple different timelines that you're syncing up. Like
Yep.
you said, it's an art and a science. You also mentioned the difference in rules, regulations, laws, security laws in some cases that you need to consider. Then you also mentioned due diligence, not from how I'm always subjected to it, meaning the developer doing their due diligence on a development, but you're also talking about due diligence to the investor themselves. Now you're talking about multiple layers of due diligence. Where do you start? So let's put ourselves in the shoes of where I feel most of my audience is first, and then we can address from the individual, meaning the individual looking to invest into EB5. But let's think of it from the developer standpoint. You mentioned timelines, right? So when is it a good time for a developer to consider EB5?
Yeah. So, a lot of developers have heard about EB5 and have been utilizing EB5 about a decade ago. And I would say the EB5 projects, I do not know the exact number, but I would believe that most of the states have used EB5 in a larger and smaller way. So this is no longer a funny little thing. Compared to maybe 10 or 15 years ago. So I think when the developer thinking of the EB5 capital, they are more and more aware of the EB5 capital is different from the bank loan or
Right.
senior loan, meaning that they don't come in at once. So you really need to, depends on the size of the project, right? So, and speaking of the size, a New York size is different from a New Jersey versus, a Texas size. But just, think about, where as an audience, if you're in Texas or New York. So let's just say a bigger project in your region, which probably need to plan a little in advance as to where the EB5 capital potentially is going to come from. Is it going to come from an agent who can deliver or have the history of deliver the EB5 capital on time or frequent enough in order to keep up your project? Versus do you have alternative short-term loan just in case the EB5 capital doesn't come in time, so it won't cause delay or any burdens for your project. But I would say once you have an idea of when the EB5 money will come in, the next question is the cost of the capital. So that varies as well. It depends on the players in the industry. So if you work with the bigger agents, for instance, because your project requires you have to work with the big agents to be able to put together or syndicate that capital for you, then your cost may be a little higher versus if you have direct sources and you can rely on referrals or just your reputation or previous clients, then your cost of capital may be a little smaller. So, these are some of the things that you need to think about before you decide whether it makes sense for you.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it doesn't operate, to clarify, and it's a good point, it doesn't operate in the way that debt does. So, for example, if you close on a bank loan, here are your funds, right?
Right.
You
Right.
have to consider this, not only is it not debt in
Yep.
general, it kind of
Right.
fits in the capital stack at a different level, but that there's a consideration to be had in terms of that it's not all at once and it can be either, however you want to could call it, in installments or phases. And that really
Right.
is dependent on a couple of things: the size of the project itself, the raise of the project itself, so the full
Mhm.
capital stack, and what the piece that you're filling with EB5 is, And also in terms of the size of the agent that is driven by how much you're trying to raise, it could also affect the cost of it, right? So
Right.
what are, or maybe what is the cost? I know it varies, but let's say we're doing some basic underwriting. What is the cost of EB5 in your experience?
Yeah, sure, of course. Like traditionally, by traditional, what I really mean is in the older days, the traditional way of structure the EB5 capital is you have a senior loan and let's just say you can, if you have a project, you can probably go to a bank and get up to 60% of your total cost of the project. And usually the EB5 investor or agents will like to see that the developer will have enough skin in the game, which requires another, 20% of equity in the deal. So the middle part, whether it be the mezz loan or the preferred equity, is usually the EB5 capital. I would say, like the size of the deal uh, has shifted a little bit since the $500,000 phase, which is in the older days versus the 800 minimum investment requirement today. So the typical project size these days, or the preferred size, is around 50 investors, which is around $40 million. So depends on how quickly the money can be raised by the different agents. The cost of capital usually ranges between 6% to 11%. So it really depends on a lot of factors like we talked about. And the other new structure that we have seen since the new rule is there will be no bank loan. So the EB5 will come in as senior. So basically it takes over the bank loan, becomes the senior position, and the developer will have probably around 30%, a little more equity in this scenario. And then EB5 will take up to 70% of the entire cost of the project. So that will probably requires a little bit higher interest rate. But again, they all have advantages and different advantages. But I would say these are the two structures that are mostly seen these days. But is a little cheaper than the mezz loan, but not necessarily not.
Very interesting. You said something there that I'm learning as well, which is that the structure of it is changing, or is that already in place? So it's considered senior.
Yep. It is already, yes, Dory, it is already changing. So there are some like relatively smaller deals that, for instance, 30 to 40 investor deals are structured with EB5 as senior. So the job creation allows them or give them enough cushion to raise up to 60 or 70% of the capital stack. And the one of the reasons driven behind this is primarily because, so in this scenario, the EB5 will really become the first lien of the project instead of the bank. So it gives the investor some comfort level as to, where they are in terms, when the project is in trouble. So that is the primary reason. But the shortfall again is even if there's, enough cushion, but doesn't mean it always works. So the cushion of the job will definitely become thinner. Imagine you're raising 70% of the capital versus 20%. And also it kind of makes the project a little riskier in terms of you really have to plan it out properly, because if the money doesn't come in, you have no fallback position because there's no bank, all of a sudden will give you a loan, right? And then even if it does, it will affect the first lien where the EB5 membership has already taken place. So that will just, become a little more complicated. So you really have to be very confident that the source of capital is steady. And if something happens, you have a fallback position.
So a couple questions from that. The first of which is more fundamental, which is EB5 is all about job creation, right? So what's the general rule of thumb for the amount of jobs that you must create, and how do you figure that out?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And I get a lot of the question from the developers because, from the developer's perspective, it doesn't matter how much he needs, he always want to know, so how much can I raise? So what is it based out of? So the short answer is it based on the job creation. So there are different formulas that usually will be implemented. So at the early phase, what the The project coordinator, I would say, will ask two questions. The first question is usually where is the project? Because your location decides whether you are EB-fiable, meaning that if it's not within a TEA zone, whether it will be urban TEA or rural TEA, then you are ruling out your EB5 option completely. And then the next question is usually the job creation, like you suggested. And where is that based out of? It's usually based out of the total cost of the project, which comprises of the hard and then the land and then the soft cost. And usually the land cost doesn't count because it doesn't create jobs. So the economist will, in this scenario, based on the projection of the sales price or the operation cost, if there is any, for instance, if it's a hotel, he will usually give you a projected or estimated job numbers. Let's say if a project creates 1,000 jobs, that usually means that you can raise up to 100 investors. And then the safe margin for that is usually one investor, 12 jobs, meaning that you can raise up to 800,000 jobs, meaning that 80 investors instead of 100 investors, just to give the safety margin for the investors.
Yeah. So
Yep.
TEA, just for the audience, is targeted employment area?
Thank you. Yes, correct.
Okay. And is that a designation who controls that designation?
Yeah, so the government usually issue the designated area, and today is very, very simple to use. In the old days, the economists have to kind of figure it out, and depends on each economic area zones, they have to line up and figure out based on the labor department numbers to figure out whether it's qualified or not. But today, they made it very simple. You go on a map and you type in your address, they pretty much can tell you right away if it's qualified. But then the job report or the job data from the labor department was issued every now and then. So you need to keep in mind that if you don't file your paper right away, you may lose the status. But if you do, you'll be grandfathered in for your TA status.
So there's a website you could go to, you could type in the address and identify whether or not it's in a TEA, and if it is, file your paperwork if it's something that you're looking for.
Yeah, it's usually pretty accurate. I won't say 100%, but usually it's pretty accurate. Yeah.
And then the other rule of thumb I heard is that for every 1,000 jobs you're creating, it's 80 investors, right?
Yes, just so that you leave 20% of margin.
Got it. Okay.
Right.
And then some of the other things you covered are the general range of cost for EB5 is between 6 and 11%. And the other question I wanted to ask was from a timeline standpoint, you made the analogy of all the different timelines that you have to fit. This hopefully will be an easier question on the timeline question, but from the investment standpoint, so something I learned just now is it can be, and it seems like it is moving forward as senior debt, first lien position. Does that come with a term, or what's the perception of when I need to pay the investor back?
Yeah, so it's a good question because that's in addition, because the investor usually cares about two things. So one is whether the jobs has been created, meaning that have you started your construction, and if you do, is it sustainable, right? Do you have enough money to complete it, or how soon can you complete it? What is your operation, right? And then the other question they care about is when are you going to give me my money back, right? And we all understand that according to our legal system or rules, the EB5 has to be deployed at risk, meaning that it cannot be guaranteed in any form, and it cannot be invested in, for instance, a municipal bond or a government bond. It needs to be used at risk. So the investor in this scenario will really have to do the due diligence in terms of getting the money back. And in the old days, because of the retrogression, meaning some investors are subject to waiting a long time, for instance, Indian and Chinese investors. So you will run into the situation where the project has completed, but then you cannot really return the capital because the immigration on the investor side is not completed. So in this scenario, the developer will have no choice but to redeploy to the next project.
Oh no, I'm sure you have to twist their arm on that.
Right. So, assuming if you have a next project, and if you don't, then you're facing in terms of how do you manage those the next project. Yeah, so you have to get the consent from the investors and then to be able to use it in the next time. But in today's world, especially after the RIA, so a lot of projects are structured with 3+1+1. So basically, it's a 3-year mezz loan and with 2 option to extend for a year each time, for 1 year each time. So it kind of coincides with the ground up development, which usually take about 3 years to build from the pre-development to the sales phase. If you have a rental project, you probably need another year to stabilize and another year to refinance. Regardless, it will be a 5-year fixed term if it's designed as a mezz structure. So that is kind of today's landscape in terms of return of capital.
That's very interesting. And that offers a lot of clarity. Of which another interesting point you brought up is that there is, if a developer is, we'll call it efficient, that there could be the opportunity to redeploy, right? So I
Right,
mean
right,
that's of interest, right? Because it's capital you don't have to re-raise per se, right? And
right.
kind of go back out to the market on what in that instance. So the other timeline is because
Right.
that's in line with the application process, right?
Mhm.
So talk us through the current timeline for the application process, and just for the audience, that's the process. And now we could shift more to the investor side. But what the investor consideration, aside from the developer due diligence or vetting, the project itself, where they are, how they're financed, but the timeline that it will take for, and I know you said that the top priorities, I guess in this case, would be post the investment, but it would be where the developer is in completion and whether or not they're going to get their money back. But let's remember that this also, the timeline that I'm referring to is in correlation to them getting, what's the proper term here, Emily? Is it citizenship? Is it a green card? Is it?
Green
Yeah.
card,
Okay.
yes.
So what's the
Yeah.
timeline for that?
Right. Yeah. So from the investor's perspective, usually, of course, every country is a little different, but just to generalize, in order for you to collect all your documents and to be ready to file your case, it usually takes about 8 weeks, sometimes a little longer, sometimes a little shorter, right? Depends on how fast you wire your money and so on and so forth. And then let's just assume that you launch the application on October 1st. It generally takes about 9 months to 11 months for your first conditional green card to be approved for the rural project. And for the urban, meaning like metropolitan, so-called metropolitan area project, it takes a little slightly longer than the rural project, just on average. But again, I just wanted to say this is more of an immigration question, but, I'm just explaining from a very general perspective. It's not an advice by any means. Yeah. But, like people need to understand it, right? So that is about, a year and a half in. And it also depends on where you'll file your application. If you file your petition as an investor within the US, for instance, you file with a H-1B visa or you're a student on a F-1 visa, under the new rule, you actually can get a concurrent filing, meaning that within 4 to 6 months, which this is a very, very big benefit for people who are already in the US and wanted to stay here. This is a great news because the concurrent filing will allow them to be able to work in the US for anybody, even starting their own firm, and to be able to travel internationally and be able to come back with advanced pro. So this is very huge for the
Yeah.
domestic investors. And then after that, you will go through the consular processing, or depends on where you are again. And then you will go to the final phase of 829, which is the job removal process, which will take about, 1 to 2 years. So I would say this whole process will take, if everything goes well, smoothly, is supposed to happen in 3 to 4 months. 3
3 to
years to
4
4
years.
years. Yes, yes.
So, okay. And that kind of frames the timeline. The good news, though,
Right.
is I'm hearing, and this is one of the revisions to the program itself, is you can actually be here during that time, right?
Yep, 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 yep. So so this is particularly important, and I think this is the key message and the benefit is for people who are in the U.S. and on a legally, allowed visa, right? Whether it will be a work visa or student visa that allow them to file the petition and get a concurrent filing done and to be able to get those two things within 4 to 6 months so they can plan their life more comfortably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's huge. And it's something that came about from our kind of pre-conversation before we started recording. But and this is not to get political, but it's just in the current political climate, especially on the topic of immigration, as you mentioned, if you're already here, that
Mhm.
this is a big channel by which you can properly get your papers in order. And in effect, it doesn't really affect you so much from this perspective of you're still able to travel and
Yep.
you're still able to work, right? Which are, or be a student. So those are
Yep.
all important.
Yep. Yep.
All right. I feel like this could be a second episode, or there can be a second episode because it's just, there's a lot to talk about, especially well, in general, when it comes to capital, number one, developers get excited about capital, especially capital resources that are, affordable, especially given the interest rate environment through the past 3 years. But also because there's just so much packed into it. Because as we said, there's timelines, there's due diligence, we didn't even really get to the investor part of it from a mentality and perspective of it. But so that we could spend just a little time on it, what are the considerations for an investor in terms of things that they either misconstrue or that they misunderstand?
Mhm.
What are the instances in which investors may be incorrect in their assumption of their ability to invest?
Yeah, so I think, the this EB5 capital is actually a very smart capital. It's not a very blind investment like the old days. People just wanted to maybe get the green card and didn't care as much as, getting the money back. But I think in today's environment, I think people want both. The investors want both. And I don't blame them for that
Yeah,
because why don't I want my money back? Right. But, like usually the investor, when they know they want to stay here and when they face hundreds of opportunities on the market, right? And then they are over flooded with information, this risk, that risk. So I can understand it's very hard to maneuver because it's as such, I constantly talk to my investors, just let them envision, like the American football, like, when two teams like, start kicking the ball and then you see like a lot of very big guys are
yeah,
going at each other and then it looks very messy, right? And you're like, what are they doing? Right. But, if you understand it, I know there's strategy, but from, a person who doesn't understand the sports, the details, it just, it looks like a mess. It
it's like
just,
chaos. Yeah,
yeah, it looks very chaotic. So, the investors probably feel the same way, because every developer or most of developers say, I have these highlights and, I have these strengths, I've done so many projects. So how do I select a project? It looks like a football field
yeah,
to them. Yeah, so what I would tell the investors when they're facing this very big field with so many options and a lot of noise. So I would tell them try to eliminate. So find a few, like you said, with the start with the closing in mind. So find the fundamentals that's important to you, right? So which asset class has proven in general to be the safest? I don't want to give the answer, but I think everyone has the answer. And
yeah,
what markets are you familiar with? Read the documents, right? Of course, the documents is two-dimensional, but it will give you a sense of whether it's in favor of investors or not in favor of investors. And even if you have the capability of return the money, but is the document construed in the way that's they do not want to return the capital, even if they can. So that can be kind of implied by their cost of capital, right? If it's very high, of course I want to return your capital, right? So, I mean, not of course, but I'm just saying in general, is a totality of the circumstances situation. But then, try to eliminate the asset class or the locations that you're not comfortable with or not familiar with,
yeah,
and then look at the value of the projects and see the fundamentals make sense. Is it a viable project? Because doesn't matter how you structure the EB5. I don't care if it's senior, I don't care if it's a mass, but is the project make sense,
right,
right? Because doesn't matter who is at first position. If I don't have money, I can't return
exactly.
anyone,
Yeah.
right?
You have to
So
view it like an investment, right? And
yes,
I think one of the hard lessons learned, although it sounds obvious, is that if a developer is not well capital, forget if the developer is even qualified. Let's just assume they're all qualified. But if it's not well capitalized, and if there's going to be a lot of things that are outside of their control, the economic
right.
aspect,
Yeah,
cost of supplies, so on and so forth. Look at the
right.
impact that COVID made, right? Look
Right.
at the impact that inflation has had. And my point being that, it's you want the project to finish because if the project doesn't finish, it generally means they weren't capitalized well enough, which means you're definitely not getting your money back, right?
Right.
And then you didn't complete the actual requirement for the job creation, so you may not even get your green card. That's something I feel like people generally have learned the hard way. That sounds obvious, but
You're
the assumption is just like, oh, it's an easy way to get a green card, which you're here to prove. That's the hard lesson I think that I have read about anecdotally or heard that many have learned. So I think what is going to ultimately be one of our closing points is, work through the people who've done it before, number one, from a regional center perspective, work through someone like Emily that can
uh,
talk you through this is like the Marvel universe in terms of just all these different timelines and all these things that you have to
right.
consider. So, in closing, what's the one piece of advice you have? And it can be either for the developer or the investor, but what's the one piece of advice you have?
Yeah, I think, one piece of advice that I can think of, or I try to capture, to cover all the circumstances is if you decide to live here, look at the big picture. Because I often see investors start to think about the global tax matters, and then they just get distracted, right? So what is the most important
Sure.
thing for you? At the end of the day, if you want to stay here, find the project that you can find that make most sense to you today. And let's worry about the rest of the factors when you have time for it, right? I'm not saying do not plan your tax. I'm just saying do not get over distracted by the insignificant factors and forget about the more important factors. And also try to be a little flexible because the rules in this space changes a lot. It has several deadlines and a lot of policy interpretation changes. So, from the developer's perspective, try to keep yourself up to date as to what's new, how that may impact your current and future projects. So have that in mind before you're planning out whether the capital makes sense or works for you.
Yeah. That
Yeah,
sounds, I didn't even think about tax. That sounds like a whole separate episode, along with all the other
right,
things that we didn't even talk about. But
right,
there's only so much time. We'll
right.
ask the audience to leave in the comments that they want episode 2 with Emily, and we'll do that accordingly. But I want to wrap up. How do people find you, Emily?
Yeah, sure. So I am very visible on LinkedIn. Even if you just Google EV5 Emily Zhu, you will find me on LinkedIn. So sometimes I post articles and the events that I attended or going to attend or host. So, if you're interested, reach out to me and come and say hi.
Yeah. So for the audience, key takeaway, EB5 is a great resource of capital, but it is also very complicated. You need the experts, you need help up front, you need your questions answered up front. So in the spirit of starting with the close in mind, definitely speak with somebody like Emily. You can find her on LinkedIn. If you need, I'm more than happy to always make a connection. But thank you, Emily, for being part of the show. Thank you for providing so much context. I feel like there's a lot that we left on the table, but still, it's enough to kind of get everyone's curiosity moving. So good luck with everything that you're doing and start with the close in mind.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me.